Hey guys, Caleb here with DSLR Video Shooter, and today we're taking a look at 4 different lenses that cost around $30 or less. For those wondering, I'm actually using one of those lenses right now, and it's around $20, and it's pretty impressive what you can pull off with these lenses. Without further ado, let's jump right in. There are 4 lenses that I purchased: a 25mm f1.4, a 35mm f1.7, a 35mm f1.6, and a 50mm f1.4. Now, all of these lenses are C-mount lenses. C-mount was heavily used for 16mm and super 16mm cameras back in the day, and they're also very popular these days for security cameras. Now, you'll notice that these lenses are very small when compared to crop or full frame lenses, and that's because they're really more designed for smaller sensors, but they do work for micro four thirds and Sony E-mount cameras. Depending on the adapter type you get, you might also be able to get these to work with Canon cameras, but the reason they work so well with Sony and larger Sony sensors is because the flange distance, or the mount of the lens from a Sony camera to the Sony sensor, there's a very small distance there. So having lenses designed for smaller sensors often works. So first, let's talk about adapter compatibility and crops. For the 25mm, there is some vignetting on the A6500. A way to solve this is to go into the menu system of the camera, turn on clear image zoom, and that way you'll be able to kind of digitally zoom in a little bit to get rid of that vignette. And this isn't a typical digital zoom, this is clear image zoom. It's a way to zoom in without destroying your image quality. So you'll still get great images, but you'll be able to get rid of that nasty vignetting on the 25mm. When it comes to micro four thirds, on that 25mm, I didn't see any cropping until I used my GH5, which has kind of a wider non-cropped sensor. But this can be fixed by turning on X-Tele in the menu system of the GH5, and then you won't see any cropping at all. For the 35mm, I only noticed just a hint of vignetting on the Sony A6500, and you could punch in just a hair with that clear image zoom to get rid of it. Otherwise, it's just more of an aesthetic. It's not really obvious like the 25mm. That 35mm on the micro four thirds sensor has no problems at all for any of the cameras, and then the 50mm had no problems on any of the cameras or sensors when it comes to vignetting. So with that out of the way, let's talk about each of the lenses individually, what I liked and disliked about them, and figure out if these are worth it for video shooting. So let's start with the 25mm. It's a nice wide field of view, and it's amazing that it works on these cameras given the size of this lens, and it's very, very small. There are 2 rings. The front ring is the aperture ring, and then the rear ring is the focus ring. There are no markings to indicate where you're at, so you'll have to look either through the front of the lens to see the aperture change, or obviously your exposure change. For the focus ring, there's nothing on there when it comes to numbers, just a near and far indicator. And I noticed that it's a pretty sloppy ring, so it's going to be difficult to make really fine adjustments because it felt like it was speeding up and slowing down when it comes to friction. But we do have to keep in mind, this is a $17 lens, and it did work really well. I was pretty happy with it. It's somewhat soft, and most of these lenses are soft wide open, but this one suffered a little more than some of the others that we'll see here in a second. If you're using a Sony camera, you are going to lose the advantage of this 25mm because you will have to zoom in a little bit to get rid of that vignetting. Next up, we have the 35mm f1.7, and this lens is actually a really great lens. I like it so much. It works beautifully with the A6500 and the micro four thirds cameras that I have. It's a little larger than the first lens, but still very small compared to most lenses that you'll come across. For rings, we have 2 of them. They're both very nicely textured, and they're both very smooth. So unlike that first lens, you're going to get great focus pulls without any inconsistencies in the focus ring friction. Unlike the first lens, the rear ring is for your aperture and the front ring is for your zooming. So this is much more natural than the first lens, and you'll find most lenses have this orientation and setup. I found that out of all the lenses, this one was the sharpest wide open, and it seemed to just be a great all-arounder. It's really nice and smooth, a great focal length, and tons of shallow depth of field at 35 millimeters. The next lens is also a 35 millimeter, but this one is f1.6 as opposed to the previous one we just looked at, which had a aperture of 1.7. This one appears to be almost identical. It's just a different housing and a slightly different optical layout. The big difference is the physical appearance and the layout of the rings. In the rear, we have a large aperture ring for changing your exposure and the aperture blades. And then the front ring is a much smaller focus ring. If you're choosing between these two, I would probably go with the previous lens we looked at, the other 35 millimeter, as it's a little easier to adjust the focus. It's more affordable, and I don't really think there's any benefit to going with this 1.6 version. That said, it has a really unique look, so if you want to go for more of a vintage rangefinder look, this lens would do the trick. And next up, we have the 50mm f1.4. This one is actually a little smaller than the previous lens, but is very similar when it comes to the physical makeup. Just like our last lens, the aperture ring is in the rear and the front ring is the focus ring. The focus ring is pretty smooth. There's a little bit of a jump when going all the way up to infinity, but otherwise it's going to work just fine for focusing when shooting video. As you'd expect, sharpness is a little rough wide open, but considering the cost, this is also a fantastic lens. Gives you tons of shallow depth of field and the ability to hop in a little bit with that 50mm focal length. So that's a quick overview of each of the lenses. There's a couple other things I want to dive into that make these somewhat unique and could be a good or bad thing depending on how you want to use them. The first is, considering the cost, there are a ton of blades on these lenses. So you'll get some nice, mostly round bokeh, and they are declicked, so you can smoothly adjust the exposure and change your aperture on the fly when shooting video, which is always nice. While we're talking about aperture blades, I did also notice that you can actually completely close them. So if you're in wildly bright scenarios, this almost has an infinite f-stop when it comes to closing the lens down and darkening up your image. The next thing is a very unique artifact to these lenses. When you set your focus, you'll notice that around the edge of your image, things will be out of focus, even if you're filming something that is flat and has a consistent plane. So in this example, I'm filming a wall, and you'll notice that the center is in focus, but the edges are out of focus. But if I move the camera in or out, that focus changes to the outside and not the center. So in short, if you have a subject in the center of the screen and they move over to the right and you don't change your focus, they will go out of focus. So filming groups of objects or people will be somewhat difficult unless you stop down your aperture. What's cool about this is even if you're filming in a scenario where there's not a ton of depth behind your subject, you're still going to get some nice blurring around the edges of your image. Now let's talk about the accessories that are optional when you purchase these lenses on either Amazon or eBay. I purchased all my lenses on eBay. It took a little longer to arrive, but there seem to be more options out there. The first is the adapters. You can actually buy these lenses on their own or pick them up with a lens adapter. The most popular versions I found were C-mount to Micro Four Thirds or C-mount to NEX or Sony E-mount. You can also pick up a hood with the lens, and that will help reduce that flare, which is a lot more prominent on these lenses compared to most normal photography lenses. The next accessory I had a lot of fun with, and you can pick these lenses up with a couple tiny macro tubes. These are essentially small little screw-on spacers that can go between the lens and the lens adapter for your camera. What this will allow you to do is move the lens further away from the camera body and get really close to your subject, which of course renders beautiful macro shots, and they're very easy to add and remove. They just screw on to the back of the lens, and then you can add your lens adapter. Most of the configurations I saw came with 2 of these little spacers, but if you purchase a couple of these lenses, you can just keep adding the spacers and get some ridiculous macro footage or photos. So at the end of the day, these aren't the most amazing lenses or optics in the world, but considering each of these lenses is around $15 to $30, I think that's totally passable for getting some really awesome footage. If you're only going to buy one of these lenses, that 35mm f1.7 is a fantastic budget lens. I'm so impressed with how well it operates when it comes to the aperture and focus ring. The overall sharpness, even wide open, and the size and form factor make it a great little lens. And if you're getting started, a cheap camera with this lens would be an awesome way to start capturing some very cinematic footage. So in closing, these aren't the greatest lenses on the planet. That said, the cost is pretty incredible on these, and I love them for little kick around lenses. They have a very unique look in that they actually add a little bit of vignetting highlighting and that blurred edge. And remember, I'm using one right now. I'm using the 35mm f1.7. So if you're on a hyper budget, these would be great. They also add a very unique look. You can also use them for risky situations where you don't want to potentially damage a more expensive lens. And with those macro tubes, I would just leave those on some of those lenses and bam, you have a great little macro lens. So I do like these, and that is going to wrap up this video. Thank you so much for watching. Check out the links in the description to the individual lenses and lens kits. Otherwise, you can watch fresh videos here at DSLR Video Shooter every single Tuesday and Thursday. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.